after the trial, she met with Scarlett's mother and uncle, and I think they'd met at like a coffee shop, and she said that it was her that had kind of wanted to do that.
And it was such an emotional meeting, wasn't it, in general? Yeah. Like, I can just imagine how that was for both sides. And one of the things that Esther says throughout this is, I lost my child, but they also lost their child in this as well. Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone, and welcome back to episode 11 of the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. So today we've got another case study for you. We're going to be discussing the brutal and heinous crime, the murder of Brianna Ghey.
This one has been a particularly harrowing one, I think. And, you know, all of the ones we've spoke about have been absolutely horrendous. But this one in particular, when I was researching, you know, I was actually quite emotional.
Yeah, I was as well. I know there's been elements in other cases that we've covered that have really got us, but I think it's kind of an accumulation of a lot in this one. We're going to be discussing it all, obviously, but for me, part of it was the amount of work that her mother has since done. I think you can really feel her raw emotion, but how incredible she is. But we'll get on to that. But then equally, this case is really difficult because, one, it's the most recent case we've covered so far.
It is, and I felt quite a lot of pressure researching this one to get everything. I mean, I know we are quite meticulous with everything we do on the podcast, and we are both perfectionists and we like to make sure everything is true and fact checked. But this one, I felt more pressure.
I did,
And I don't know if it's because it's more recent or because of the events that took place. I don't know. I felt an immense amount of pressure to get this one right.
I have as well. So forgive us, bear with us. Hopefully everything that we discuss is, well, it should be as accurate as we can possibly make it. Again, we only use sources that are reliable, and as we say, the amount of kind of work that we've put into it will hopefully.
We say this on a lot of the case studies, but we do a hell of a lot of background work on these cases, not just finding information from like one source or just listening to other podcasts on it. Like, we go to sometimes 3, 4, 5 different sources, make sure the information's correct. We watch documentaries, we listen to things on it, don't we?
Which I think, to be fair,
that's
is
how
the
it
only
should
way.
be.
Is the only way I think I'd be happy to cover it.
And in this one, I actually listened to a lot of the interviews with Brianna's mom, which we're going to come on to. And the work that she's been doing, and I've got a whole section on that at the end, because it is she's a really amazing woman, isn't she, for what she's doing.
So as I've mentioned, today's case is difficult in a number of ways, not only because of the victim and the life of the victim, Brianna, and we're going to discuss her life, but also I think the age of all involved. Brianna was 16 at the time of her murder, but the offenders, 2 offenders in this case, were both 15. And I think it's kind of easier. We've talked about the giving the offenders like almost like a mask of a monster. And it's a lot easier to do that with people that have been in and out of prison and offenders that have been violent in the past. This is, there's kind of no rhyme or reason. It's 2 children that have committed such horrific acts. So what we're going to do, which is what we do with every case really, but we're going to be really specific about each section today, so that if there is anything that you don't want to listen to or anything you don't want to watch, you can skip ahead, and you don't have to go through it. But I think hopefully the case that we're covering today is going to highlight the struggles that young people go through.
Yeah.
Highlight the amazing young woman that Brianna was, but then also talk about how there is sometimes just people that commit acts that can't be explained, and what Esther, Brianna's mum, does so incredibly, which we're going to talk about at the end, is basically find a way to still see some good in the world and encourage kindness.
She's done a very good job of that. And when we get to the end, it'll all come together and you'll see why we speak so highly of Esther in this situation, because there is stuff that she's done that I, quite frankly, could not do in this situation. So a bit about the background. We're going to do our usual background on Brianna, and she was, like we said, only 16 at the time, but there is a lot of background in general to her sort of personality and Brianna's home life, isn't there? And she seems like she was such a fun young woman,
definitely.
wasn't she?
Yeah. So we, again, one of our sources, we watched the ITV News special.
Yep.
And in that there was interviews with 3 of her best friends. And again, they were kind of sat holding hands as they talked about how incredible she was.
Yeah.
They said that they all wanted to be more like Brianna because she said it like it was. She was honest. She was just good fun, and she was confident. She was a confident young woman.
Yeah. Her mum said in one of the interviews as well, she was very funny. She liked being sort of the centre of attention. But then on the flip side of it, she did also struggle with anxiety.
Yes.
And her mum quite openly talks about her struggle with anxiety, mental health, and her eating disorders.
Yes. So she lived with her family in Warrington, which is in Cheshire, and she went to Birchwood Community School. That has become quite a prominent part of the case, I think.
Yeah.
Not only because her head teacher has spoken so highly of Brianna, and again, there was quite a few different interviews with classmates of hers, other people that she was at school with, and then obviously her friends. But then equally what we will talk about is the fact that that's also where she met her offenders.
Yeah. And just to go back to what Brianna's mum was saying, she actually said that Brianna had started growing her hair out. She had got an interest in makeup. And then she told her mum that she was transgender.
Yes.
So her mum said that didn't faze her in the slightest. It didn't faze Brianna and it didn't faze her mum. She said she wanted like what all parents want for the children, and just to be happy. And she was so accepting, and Brianna then started wearing the girls' school uniform. She had the long hair.
Yeah, and equally the school were amazing, weren't they?
They were,
The school were incredibly... I hate the phrase like accommodating. Like, well, of course they should be.
They should be accommodating,
but the school were, and really it sounds like compassionate, and gave Brianna kind of as much as she needed to navigate such a massive change for her.
Yeah.
So Brianna was a transgender woman, and through exploring that side of herself and becoming a transgender woman, she found a lot of comfort in the community online.
Yeah.
So she had got a TikTok channel, which had become really big, hadn't it? It became really big.
She'd actually got over 30,000 followers on her TikTok account, and the head teacher, I don't know if you saw this bit when the head teacher was talking about Brianna, said there was often times where she had to pull Brianna up and say, you can't be filming TikToks in school or in the school toilets, and it's just what kids do, isn't it?
Yeah.
But she really liked that sort of online presence, and I think she was really starting to find her community on there, wasn't she?
And in fact, there was another interview with another one of her best friends, but they'd never actually met. they had become friends via TikTok. It was another transgender young girl.
That's nice.
And they'd become friends through TikTok, and they used to FaceTime all the time.
Yeah.
They'd call each other, they'd ring each other. And she said that she actually, and I thought this was beautiful, described her friendship with Briana as being a needle in a haystack kind of relationship where you just don't come across it. And she says she probably won't again.
Yeah, and to some people that might sound strange, as in your best friend is online and you've never met that person. But remember, like, sort of in this day and age, a lot of things are online now, aren't they? And a lot of Brianna's social interactions were actually online and not in person. Her mum said she wasn't one to be going out. She'd much rather be at home, talking to her friends online, filming her TikToks and doing her social media.
And a big part of that, again, which has been referenced, is the fact that they had to go through the pandemic. So a lot of interactions through that period of time just had to be online. So actually, younger kids these days, that's their base for maintaining friendships and keeping in touch with people.
Yeah.
So they're bound to feel more comfortable with what they used to, which is actually online rather than in person. And as we've mentioned, Brianna did struggle with anxiety. So going about in the world is a lot more difficult in that sense.
Yeah, and like I said, the lockdown probably didn't help with her anxiety either, because we did have, like, what was it, 2 years?
2 years,
of not being basically allowed out.
And if you think of when you were a teenager, my God, I was going through so much, like mentally and friendship-wise, and I just cannot imagine having the whole upheaval of COVID on top of all of the other stuff that I'm trying to navigate as just being a human when you're
a
15,
teenager.
16.
Yeah.
So Brianna was confident. She had an ability to be herself. She was lovely, funny, witty, fearless. There are so many words that people have used to describe her.
Yeah.
But as we have kind of alluded to, she did struggle. So she was more complex than people at school maybe or on TikTok may have first assumed.
Yeah, with social media, I suppose you can be who you want to be, and it is sort of a bit of a front, can't it, really?
Yeah.
And with Brianna's mom actually talked about Brianna getting trolled.
Yes.
And how it upset Esther, Brianna's mom, more than it did Brianna. But we both know that in a situation where you're getting trolled, it can be quite upsetting. And I've been through trolling on social media before, and after a while it does really get to you. So I can't imagine that would have helped with her mental health. But her mum said it was just sort of like water off a duck's back.
I think it's one of those, for me at least, it's one of those things where it depends, and this sounds daft, but it depends what people say. If people are being cruel about something that I'm completely confident with, I don't care. We've recently had, and I posted it on my story, a guy that commented on the fact that men don't like women with short hair. That didn't bother me at all because I'm more than confident with my short hair.
And you prefer your short hair to before, don't you?
However, if someone commented on my voice, because please don't start doing that, because I'm self-conscious about my voice, that's what gets me. So it's where I think it is when it hits a nerve.
Yeah.
And so Brianna, there were probably a lot of comments that she got that she didn't take any notice of because she's more than comfortable in her own skin.
Yeah.
But there would have been other things that people would say.
And it depends how much people say it as well. There's been times where I used to get called fat all the time, nearly every day online.
Yeah.
And then it didn't bother me at first. I was just like, whatever, it is what it is. But then as those comments kept coming, and then more people would comment on it because they'd see that comment, they'd say the same thing. And then the same thing gets said over and over and over again. Even as a grown woman, I was like, wow, I'm getting called fat at least 10 times a day here. Like, what the hell is going on?
Yeah, and you do go internal, you go, well, maybe there's some weight in it. And sorry, that was a poor choice of words. But yeah, you say maybe there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
Maybe I am. And you start looking at photos of yourself differently.
And you only imagine what that's like for us now as grown women.
Yes.
What it would have been like for a teenager, a 16-year-old.
Yeah.
Like you said, on top of everything else that's going on in their lives.
Yeah.
It's probably not gonna help with the mental health side of things at all.
So when Brianna was 15, she'd actually been diagnosed with being on the autism spectrum.
Yeah.
But then as well as that, she was struggling with her mental health and had anxiety. But she'd also been hospitalised due to a rapid amount of weight loss.
Yeah.
And her mum mentions, I know that it says that she was diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum. I didn't actually see anything that said she had been diagnosed with an eating disorder, did you? But she was hospitalised
due to it. Yeah, so, a mum said due to a eating disorder. And also the ADHD as well. She was diagnosed with, and I think due to her sort of anxiety and her ADHD altogether, she was preparing for her GCSEs. She had to have quite a specific school schedule at this point, just so that she didn't have to be in the hustle and bustle of the corridors or even eating lunch in the school canteen.
Yeah.
As someone with anxiety, I can imagine that's quite a daunting thing when everyone's in there.
Yeah, definitely.
And
again, I've got friends with ADHD, and they say that like you just can't concentrate on what's going on in front of you when there's so much buzzing around you. So at lunch, I would imagine that, again, if she's quite a confident person, she's going to have people coming up to her and talking to her and chatting to her.
Yeah.
And then that sets off her anxiety because you can't think about any of what's going on in front of you when there's so much around you.
Yeah.
But again, her school were really good with that, weren't they? They'd got her the ability to kind of go in a room on the side so that she could revise
they'd actually got what they call an inclusion unit in their school, and it is for people who need sort of one-to-one learning. And after she had been hospitalised, she needed more of a sort of selective schedule and somewhere where she could really concentrate and get her head down, because I think she'd missed a little bit of the
content
coming up to the GCSEs as well. So she was getting that one-on-one help that she needed, and in an environment where it was nice and quiet in this inclusion unit. So the school did seem quite good at catering, didn't they? And helping her out in this situation. So it was a very bespoke timetable.
Yeah. So from the age of 15, she's been diagnosed with ADHD. That comes with a whole set of worries in itself, because it's like, you know, you're probably going to be medicated at that point to a degree. How do you feel about that? There's a whole set of thoughts and feelings. Again, on the autistic spectrum, you'd have a lot of different feelings. There's so much resource about it, but it's kind of like, well, where do I sit in that spectrum?
So I would have thought that's quite overwhelming as well.
Then you've got all of the stuff with social media and TikTok, which, yes, she found a positive. But again, we've talked about some of the difficulties with that. So for a young woman, there is a lot to navigate at that stage.
So with Brianna's background being like it is, at home, she lived with her stepdad and a mom. And as far as we can see, it was a very normal, happy upbringing, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I feel like I got the impression she was quite close to her mom.
Yes.
Which is really nice. And in this inclusion unit at school is where she met Scarlett Jenkinson, who we are going to come on to next.
Yeah. So we're going to discuss the actions, the events that led up to Brianna's murder. It was a Saturday afternoon, and it was the 11th of February 2023. And Brianna, again, was honest with her mum and talked to her mum quite regularly about what she was doing and stuff, because her mum did actually say that they used to argue sometimes over like restrictions on mobile phones and stuff like that. But she had told her mum that she was off to meet a friend, Scarlett. They'd been friends for a few months, and they'd met in that inclusion unit at school.
So Scarlett had been moved over to Birchwood Community School due to things that had gone on in her previous school. Yeah. And they'd said that she needed to be moved over because if not, it was sort of to avoid a suspension from the original school.
Well, she'd been excluded, hadn't she, from the original school?
Yeah, she'd got, I think it was a 5-day exclusion that she'd got, but I think they were looking into making it permanent or to avoid having a permanent exclusion.
Yeah. So she did know Scarlett quite well. Esther, her mum, said that she'd never personally met her, but she obviously knew of her.
Yeah, you come home and talk about her, don't you?
Because she was comfortable with Brianna going to meet her. So on the 11th of February, she said that they were going to meet at Linear Park, which is in Warrington. And it was actually only 3 miles away from the school. So it was only local.
Yeah.
But this was a big deal for Brianna.
Yeah, she didn't really go out and go and socialise and do these things. And her mum said it was the first time that she'd ever caught the bus on her own.
And that's huge. As someone that's struggled with public transport and anxiety in the past, it's horrendous. The thought of having to get a bus somewhere, even if it's familiar, is big enough. Daft things like what side of the road you need to be on and whether I'm going to pay. Well, at that point it was cash, but whether or not you're going to pay with cash or card or what to say, especially when you're getting on your own, because if you've got other friends that are already getting on, then you just say same.
You just copy them. Yeah.
So yeah, big deal for Brianna to go and meet Scarlett, which again just goes to show how comfortable she must have been with that friendship, because she's willing to put all of those worries and anxieties aside and go through it anyway.
Yeah, and when Brianna got on the bus, there was actually CCTV, wasn't there, of her on the bus.
Yeah.
And she looked quite distinctive.
Yeah.
So she was wearing like a white fluffy coat. She'd got a tartan skirt on. She got over the knee socks.
Yeah.
So she was wearing quite maybe quite distinctive, or you would recognise what she was. You would notice and remember what she was wearing if you'd seen her. So yeah, she got on the bus and went to go and meet her friend Scarlett. But when she did get off the bus to meet Scarlett, there was another person there. Yeah. So this other person was Scarlett's friend, and he was called Eddie Ratcliffe. So Eddie and Scarlett actually knew each other from being, I think, about 11 years old.
Yeah, and that was through the primary school, wasn't it?
Yeah, so they'd been to school together.
And so obviously, then having almost been kind of reunited when Scarlett then moved over to Birchwood, they'd kind of, I think they'd constantly been in contact, hadn't they?
Yeah.
But as far as we know, Brianna wasn't as aware of Eddie.
She didn't know Eddie personally, I don't think.
No.
But Eddie in general was quite an intelligent individual. Mm-hmm. He had got GCSEs already, and he was teaching himself A-levels because he wanted to do something to do with science in university.
Yes.
So he'd sort of got his life pretty much planned out, but I think without Scarlett, he did come across as a bit of a loner. Yeah. And maybe it was Scarlett that had befriended him and brought him maybe out of his shell.
Yeah, because he was quite socially awkward, wasn't he?
Yeah.
So if we return to the Saturday afternoon on the 11th, there is, again, CCTV footage of Brianna getting off the bus, meeting her two friends, and then them walking towards Linear Park, which again is where the events unfolded. So now we are going to talk about the discovery of Brianna's body. Again, if there's anything that you find difficult in this, please feel free to skip ahead. As we've mentioned, they'd gone into Linear Park, and I think the timeline is quite important here.
Yeah, it is, yeah.
So they had met at about 10 to 2. Again, that's on CCTV, so we know that for certain. But by 3:13, a 999 call was made, and that was due to the discovery of Brianna's body.
It's not a very long time. And you think about it's broad daylight here.
Yeah.
It's not in the nighttime. It's not, sort of in February, it would be quite dark early on.
Yeah.
Even 6, 7 o'clock at night would be going dark. This is something that happened in broad daylight in a public park.
In a public park, yeah. And it's a Saturday. It's not even like they've skived school and there's not going to be many people around at the park.
Yeah.
It's going to be busy. So the reason that we're skipping to the discovery of Brianna's body, we will obviously explore this as we continue, but the actual events that unfolded, no one is quite sure of. We're going to talk about the evidence further down the line, but for now we are just going to talk about when the police were alerted to the death of Brianna. So at 3:13, a couple called 999 and said that they had found a female victim who was laid down on her front,
Yeah, face down,
and was bleeding heavily. And they said that it looked like she had been stabbed in the neck, from what they could see, and that obviously paramedics and backup needed to attend.
Yeah, I actually listened to the reenactment of the 999 call, and it was actually Catherine Vise and her husband Andrew, and they were just out on a dog walk. Yeah. And I know we always say, don't we? Well, if you talk to police officers, they always say it's like runners and dog walkers that usually discover bodies because they're out, like early in the morning, and the dogs will sniff it out.
And again, quite often, if you've got a dog, you might go off the beaten track a little bit as well.
Yeah. So they discovered the body, and I just think how horrific was that for this lady and her husband to come across something like that. So obviously, if you find a body, it's always going to be unexpected. Yeah. But in the middle of the daytime and
such a young victim as well, to find someone, the age of Brianna at 16, horrendous. It's absolutely horrendous. I can't imagine it. And in actual fact, the place that they found Brianna, where the murder had taken place, was actually only half a mile from the car park.
Yeah.
It was so close.
Not very far into the car park. And it was actually when the police had been called, you can imagine someone's saying on the 999 call, we found a body. The police are going to send, every sort of service possible, aren't they, there?
Yeah.
And there was so much noise, there was the sirens, and Brianna's mom, Esther, was actually walking her dog, not in the park, obviously in a different location near her home, and she heard the commotion and heard all the sirens, and she actually joked and said, I'll be ringing the police soon if Brianna doesn't turn her phone on, because she'd actually got her phone turned off and Esther had tried to contact her. So she joked to, I think, maybe her husband at the time, it'll be me ringing the police soon. And you just think, like, looking back at that now,
it gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, these are the bits that really got me when Brianna's mum Esther was talking, and the pure emotion that was there even now. And I know obviously it's not long ago. I feel like the emotions are still quite raw with something like that.
So it was actually Officer Chadwick. It was a female officer that was first on scene with Brianna. Obviously paramedics came out also, but unfortunately by 4:02, so again, if the ambulance was called at 3:13 and then by 4:02, after the ambulance crew had come out and was working on Brianna, unfortunately she was then pronounced dead at the scene.
Yeah.
Again, Esther gives a really heartfelt thank you to Officer Chadwick for being there with Brianna for that really horrific time and effectively for her last moments.
Yeah.
And says how much it means to her that she knows that Officer Chadwick was there with her.
Yeah.
As she would have been so scared and just, not knowing what was going on at that time.
With these sort of interviews from Esther, I think I pretty much teared up at every single one that I listened to her do. It was just so like heartfelt, wasn't it? And you can sort of put yourself into you sort of feeling it, aren't you? Obviously nowhere near as much as she is, but you just think, oh God, my heart just goes out to her, and I just think, how can something so horrific have happened?
Yeah. So it became quite clear to officers and paramedics quite quickly that it was a stabbing that Briana had endured, and she'd actually been stabbed 28 times. So 28 times in a park in the middle of the day by, as far as she was aware, friends.
Someone who she called a friend, at least one of the people she considered a friend.
And at that point, they'd known each other for months. So it became clear that Scarlett, the friend, was effectively the driving force behind this attack.
Yeah, and I think just before we go on to talking about her, the Catherine who actually rang the police and reported finding Brianna's body, she gave a description of two people leaving the scene.
Yes. So obviously when obviously they've made the 999 call, so one of the first things that officers would want to do is talk to the witnesses.
Yeah.
And they said that, again, they were just walking the dog and they'd actually seen two people, but almost as soon as they'd made eye contact with the two people, or as soon as they'd spotted them, they then fled off almost, which is when obviously their eye was then drawn to Briana.
Yeah.
So again, just the timing of it all to me is incredible. It's
Yeah, like you said, the timeline of events is really big in this case, isn't it? Because it looks like Catherine and her husband Andrew did find Briana pretty soon after the attack had taken place, because the offenders were still at the scene.
Yeah.
Just as they were leaving, it feels like it all sort of, flows.
Unravelled very quickly.
Yeah, it does.
So we are now going to talk about the evidence and the further detail in terms of the case and the attack, because again, even in terms of the arrest of the two offenders, everything happened quite quickly.
It did, and just to go back to Brianna's mom and the family in general, how horrific it must have been for Esther to arrive home from her dog walk and her front door already be open and the police officers were already in her house. She said in one of her interviews she just knew at that point that something bad had happened.
I almost feel like there is that mother's intuition, and the fact that she'd almost made a comment about it in the first place goes to show that that was on her mind. She obviously knew that Briana was out with a friend, but that she'd had to get the bus for the first time on her own. She's probably worried for Briana already.
Yeah.
And then, as soon as you see something like that
and
at your front door.
her phone being turned off as well, you would as a parent worry.
Yeah.
But because Briana had been honest with the mom and told her where she was going and told her who she was meeting, that meant that Esther could then say to the police, this is where my daughter went and this is who she went to go and meet.
Yes.
So they've already got a first name of one of the people who would have been either a suspect or a witness or the last person to see Briana.
Yeah.
So I feel like it all leads on to sort of the trail of identifying who these suspects are.
Yes. So we've got the couple that witnessed the two offenders.
Yeah.
And then we've also got Esther, who has said, okay, yes, that is my daughter and this is who she was going to meet. So obviously the police are doing all they can at this point to track down this Scarlett that she was meeting.
I think they looked at the school records because Esther had said this is someone who goes to my daughter's school.
And also being in that inclusion unit as well, it would probably been more easy to identify.
Yeah.
Because even if there's more than one Scarlett, there probably wasn't more than one Scarlett.
In the inclusion unit at the same time as Briana, yeah.
So it was actually just 4 days after the murder that both of Brianna's killers, the two suspects, were arrested and, in fact, charged with murder. I found that really interesting as well, because you have to have a lot of evidence at that point to
be able to charge
someone with murder. Arresting someone on suspicion is very different. You don't actually need an awful lot of evidence
to do it on suspicion,
to arrest them on suspicion. And that is why quite often that length of time that they're in custody is so crucial, because then what they're actually trying to do is gather as much information as possible, as much evidence as possible, to be able to say, yeah, you're not getting released, we're actually now going to charge you.
Yeah, and these two suspects were actually arrested simultaneously. So at the exact same time, they went to each of their homes, obviously, so the other person is not alerted to the other person being arrested and, destroy anything or get rid of evidence. But I thought this whole part where it shows them getting arrested and the police got this on body cam, I thought listening to this, it was very cold.
Very cold, and I thought quite telling.
Yeah.
Very telling. Scarlett, the first thing that Scarlett says, it's almost as if obviously it's easy to say now because we know the outcome and we do know that she is guilty. But to me, I would have been so scared if I had multiple police officers come into my house.
She didn't sound too bothered by it to me.
No, and to me, again, we work with teenagers. You can tell when they're kind of putting on a concerned or a sad voice. And to me, that is how, again, to me, that's how I perceived it. That's how it came across. The first thing she says is, "Oh, is this just because I was the last person to see Brianna?"
Yeah.
It didn't feel to me genuine. But again, it's easy to say after the fact when we know that she is guilty.
Yeah, she also, in the time that in the time that they found Brianna's body and her getting arrested.
Yeah, this is ridiculous.
She posted a tribute to Brianna on Facebook because she thought that would then cover her tracks.
Yeah, she'd done one on Snapchat as well. She'd put it on a Snapchat story and it was a picture of Brianna and it said something along the lines of, I can't believe it, one of the most beautiful people I've ever met. Sick, whoever done this, she'd said. Sick individual or sick person to have done this. But again, calculated. It shows that it's a calculated attack. Meanwhile, simultaneously, Eddie Ratcliffe was also arrested. And again, just didn't seem overly fazed by it.
I think the pair of them thought that they were too clever, that they would get away with this. And I don't know how, when they've done something in broad daylight so horrific, they seem to be so arrogant that they thought this will never
come back to
this one. Yeah. And even Scarlett at some point had said to Eddie, "Oh, don't worry, the police in this area are shit. We're never going to get caught."
Yeah.
So it just shows how arrogant they actually...
Yeah, and at the age of 15, because actually both of the offenders at this time were only 15, so they were actually a year younger than Brianna. In terms of them as individuals, we've kind of mentioned Scarlett a little bit already. But again, to give you a bit of context, she, again, as far as we know, had quite a good family background.
Yeah, her mum was a home economics teacher, I think, that she lived with. And it seemed like there was photos of family holidays, day trips out.
Yeah. Scarlett is the youngest of 4 siblings. And said to have been big into gaming. She was quite a big gamer. But actually, again, we referenced that she'd had to move schools to Birchwood. And that was actually because as far as the previous school had known or been able to tell, she'd actually either laced herself or brought into school effectively sweets which had cannabis in them.
Yeah, there were the little
given them to
cannabis gummies. That she had then given to another pupil, but not told her what it was. So she probably said, "Oh, here's a sweet. Do you want a sweet?"
Yeah.
And then that girl had reacted badly. Because you don't even know what people are allergic to. You don't know how people's bodies are going to react.
No, especially not at like 15, 16.
And even something with, sort of cannabis gummies, we don't know where she got them from. We don't know what was actually in them.
No.
You don't know. You just don't know anything about them.
To do that just for a laugh is, to me, do you know what I mean? Says something about the nature of her, what she finds funny in, and what she finds gets enjoyment from. And actually, when we talk about Eddie, yes, they'd been friends for a while, but a lot of their shared interests did come from this dark side, this dark interest that they shared. And that was an interest in serial killers. It was an interest in
sort of horror movies.
Horror.
There's a lot of horror movie references, wasn't there, as well?
Yeah.
Just like there is, I know, like there is a lot of children, and when I was younger, I absolutely loved horror movies and scaring the life out of myself. But she was always posting, oh, I've watched all these horror movies, I've run out of horror movies. Has anyone got any more recommendations?
Yeah.
Like she was on it with these, watching these religiously. And then in with the obsession with serial killers as well.
Yeah.
And I mean, obviously what we do, we research and we look at these serial killers and we look into the backgrounds of them, and it's
I think the difference for me is when you idolize them.
That's exactly what I was trying to get out. Like, we look at them in terms of what they've done and, the victims, and we talk about things like that. She was in awe of them.
Yes.
Almost.
Yeah.
And like you said, idolizing and looking up to these people who had killed multiple people and were dangerous individuals.
But quite a lot of this dark interest was hidden. So again, her new head teacher, Emma Mills, had said that she was quiet and polite and that there was no alarm bells. Again, we mentioned that Eddie was really studious. So he was quite socially awkward, but incredibly studious and wanted to learn.
Yeah, again with Eddie, just something that's just popped into my head. So he actually lived with his mom, his dad, and I think he had siblings as well. And his dad owned a gym, and they were actually, was it martial arts that they did?
Yes.
Or kickboxing.
Kickboxing.
So they were a family of kickboxers, and they had actually represented the UK in Jamaica at one of the sort of championships. I can't remember what it was. Was it the...
I don't know. But yeah, it was quite a
very prestigious competition.
Yeah.
And Eddie had actually missed the first week of school due to this. So he was a little bit of they said a local celebrity, because he'd missed school and then all of a sudden joined, and he'd been representing England.
Yeah.
So he seemed like he had quite a lot going for him. But the problem is, when you have two people who do have these dark thoughts, so you've got Scarlett and you've got Eddie, and independently they might have been having these thoughts, but then when you bring them together, it then escalates these thoughts, because they've found a person who shares the same interest and they can talk with each other about
someone
it.
to confide in, isn't
Yes.
it?
And I think that's what Scarlett did a lot with Eddie, and it does seem like on a lot of the things she was maybe the one who was more forward and more open about these thoughts.
And that makes sense with what we know about Eddie, because Eddie was actually, again, diagnosed as autistic, and he was actually a selective mute. So quite often it would only be his mother that he would actually communicate with. And so again, it comes back to social media. For him, it made sense that Scarlett and he would communicate via text or Snapchat, social media, to talk about these things and find out more about them in more detail, rather than, back in the day when you'd go out to play with logs.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we've given you a bit of an insight into the suspects, into the offenders as people, but now we will talk about, again, further a closer look into their relationship, but this is due to the evidence that was then discovered.
Yeah, so when both suspects were arrested and taken to the police station, the police would obviously then search both of their houses. And it was just, this to me was quite shocking what was found in both the locations.
Yeah.
So in Eddie Radcliffe's house,
Bear in mind he's 15.
he had got a hunting knife and he had got clothes that were covered in blood. So he'd kept both of these items.
Yeah.
And you seem to think like, was it just pure arrogance that they thought they were going to get away with it?
Yeah.
Or were they keeping them as like a
trophy.
token or a trophy? Because we'll get into that when we talk about the text messages.
Yeah.
But, people do often take something from the victim,
Do you know what I thought as well, though? I thought of it from more of a childish perspective. I thought that actually with the clothes that had the blood on them, he probably didn't know how to use the washing machine, didn't want to get caught by his mum saying, why are you using the washing machine?
Oh, and you can't just chuck them in the wash basket and let your mum wash them, can you?
Yeah. So I thought of it as being quite a, like, one of those problems that they wouldn't have calculated, they wouldn't have thought of in advance, but then actually that's when you realise how young they are, because they wouldn't have known how to do it. Yeah.
I didn't actually think of it like that, so that's a different perspective on it. So you've got the knife and the clothing found in Eddie's house, and then when they went on to look in Scarlett's house, there was actually a handwritten note that was found, and I've written this down, so I'm going to read the note out to you so that I get it word for word. So the note said, Saturday, the 11th of February, 2023, victim, Brianna Ghey, plan, meet at Wooden Post at 1 p.m. and walk down to Library bus stop and wait for Brianna to get off the bus. Then the three of us walk to Linear Park, go to the pipe tunnel area, and when I say the code word, he stabs her in the back, I stab her in the stomach, drag the body to the area, we both cover up the area with logs, etc. And that was a handwritten note with the entire plan.
Of two 15-year-olds.
Yeah. That actually, when that was on the documentary, that note, and I was listening to it for the first time, that actually sent chills.
Yeah.
You just think this is a premeditated attack where an innocent teenager has been lured to the park for the reason that they were going to kill her.
And equally, I think there's something in physically writing it as well. The chances are, well, not the chances are, because it's fact. They'd planned this, as we say, well in advance. There was another list that they'd written of 5 people that they'd want to kill, and Brianna was on that list.
Yeah,
it's
they had
something.
Even having a kill list.
Yeah.
As a 15-year-old, male or female, I can't think. There's probably people that I disliked at that age. Don't get me wrong.
Yeah.
But to sit down and think, I'm going to write a kill list, and Scarlett had actually spoke about how she wanted to kill other people that were on the kill list, not just Brianna.
Well, I think they did. I think they were under the impression that they would be able to kill all of
them.
Yeah,
and it was just so ridiculous reasons as well. So one of the boys on the kill list was someone who was the girlfriend of someone who Eddie fancied. Some people on the list had upset Scarlett's boyfriend.
Right. Yeah.
It's such petty reasons. It's nothing. And these people were sort of, lucky that these people had got caught and they weren't the first target. But I think Brianna, they seem to think would be the easier target, because in some of the exchange that we'll go into, they actually wanted to start with one of the boys on the list. And I don't think they could get him where they wanted him, but they knew that because Brianna was a friend, she trusted them already and she would come and meet them.
Yeah.
And it would be technically easier to kill Brianna than it would be to kill one of the boys first.
Yeah. And to me, with the handwriting of the note, quite a lot of the evidence was found in text messages.
Yeah.
Between the two, but that handwritten note to me almost like smacked of being proud of this plan.
Yep.
It wasn't like it was just information that she was trying to pass to Eddie. They'd obviously already got a plan in motion and both of them knew what was going to happen. It's almost like this handwriting it out was just for her own satisfaction, to say, this is how we're going to do it and this is what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense to me. There was kind of no need for it to be written down like that. It's not like she's going to pass it Eddie in the class And that's how he finds out about it, because everything was via text message.
Yeah, and just to go back to like the length of this planning and what we found out a little bit later about how long this had been planned for. So there was actually text messages that went back to November 2023 where they were talking about murder. So a good few months before.
Yeah.
So it'd been planned for quite a while, or it had been starting to be planned and then put into motion and then escalated. And there was a lot about whether it was, fantasy about killing someone, but they weren't just like fantasizing about it. They were putting things into place to make sure it could be carried out.
Yeah.
So in the text messages, the police officer on the documentary had said they were both actually quite naive as to think that they pressed delete and they thought that all these messages would disappear.
Yeah.
And I suppose, when you don't know a lot about digital forensics, like even I wouldn't say I'm a expert or know a great deal about it, but I know a basic level of, deleted items can be retrieved. So in January, Eddie actually boasted about a knife that he'd bought on the text messages.
Yeah, so we mentioned that a knife was found in the search of his home, but he did have, that was one of his interests. So yes, there was this general interest in kind of dark areas and serial killers and that kind of thing. But for him, it was particularly knives he had an interest in. And one of the text messages that was actually sent from Scarlett to Eddie actually said, "What knife you bringing?" And it's like for me, again, languagey, it's the you that it's like, it's so casual, yeah. And you think there's no seriousness or awareness of the severity of what they're talking about. It is just as if like, oh, what you wearing to a gig on Friday night.
And is what really got me as well. They went from talking about murder and knives and killing people to then, I'll be back soon, I'm just going to have my tea.
Yeah.
And then they'd come back and get back into the conversation, and then it'd be talking about something else.
Yeah.
It was as if it was almost normal for them to have this conversation.
It's very nonchalant, isn't it? And again, at one point he said like, oh, it's such and such a knife. I don't know the name of the knife, but he said it's such and such a knife. It's the one that I showed you over FaceTime or something, over video call. And she actually responded, "Are you sure that will kill her?"
Wow. Yeah. She actually said in some of the messages as well, she spoke about killing someone with a sharp blade, and she referred to Sweeney Todd a lot that she'd been watching. So as the blade, obviously she wanted to kill someone and be relating it to the horror movie.
But again, if you're a 15-year-old with a keen interest in knives, it's not like having a keen interest in football, is it? Where a lot of your mates are going to be like talking about the same thing. So if she's then referencing, even if she's not as interested and she doesn't know the technical names and stuff, if she is referencing Sweeney Todd and showing an interest, then of course that is, like you said earlier, going to escalate.
Yeah.
Because there's someone to bounce those effectively ideas off.
Yeah. She was also talking about trophies, which really got me as well. So she was saying, if we kill this boy, could I keep something from the victim, maybe a tooth or an eye? And like, she was thinking about this in so much detail. It was crazy.
So much detail, and yet all I think is it's so childish. There's such a naivety to it.
There is, yeah.
It is like they've watched a fantasy film and that they're wanting to replicate it effectively. The way that she would talk about these things, to me, just showed how naive and what's the word? Disconnected from reality it was.
Yeah. Another thing that was exposed in the text messages between Eddie and Scarlett is that Scarlett had already previously tried to kill Briana.
Yeah.
And she'd done this by giving her some tablets. So she wanted to make it look like an overdose, and she said that Briana was obviously already depressed and was struggling with her mental health, so people wouldn't question it if she took an overdose. And she stated in the messages that she'd given Briana a large overdose, and she couldn't understand why Brianna had got such a high tolerance. But when this was then passed on to the mum, Esther said that she came home from work one day and Brianna was in a lot of pain in the bathroom. She said she was writhing around on the bathroom floor. She was violently sick, and it matched up with the time of those text messages. So Brianna's body had obviously rejected the tablets. Yep. Luckily, she'd thrown them up. Mm-hmm. And Scarlett was saying, it should have been enough to kill her. And Eddie was saying, well, why don't you try doubling the dose? We could even put it in a Mackey's milkshake. Like, it's so, like you said, there's no regard for anyone in this situation.
And equally, I think that goes to show another element of their personality, because you would like to think that most 15-year-olds, if they had done something like that, they would suddenly think, shit.
Yeah, what am I going to do?
What have I done?
Yeah.
What have I done? I've almost killed someone there. Yeah. And thank God it didn't work, because what did I think I was doing?
Yeah.
And in actual fact, it went completely the opposite way. She was annoyed that it hadn't worked, and they were then trying to come up with other ways of making it happen. And I do think that a lot of kids, you do it loads when you're a kid, don't you? You kind of test the boundaries. You think about doing something stupid. The minute that you do it, you think, oh shit,
shouldn't have done that.
My mum's going to find out. This is going to happen. This is going to happen. And they've just not got that innate response.
No. And in the text messages, when they were actually planning Brianna's murder, Scarlett said, well, I'll give you the code word, you stab her first, but then make sure you give me the knife, because I want to know what it feels like. Stabbing someone sounds fun. And you just think, how can someone be talking about someone's life like that? It's crazy.
Yeah.
To me, it's just the whole thing, the whole way through. Like, a lot of the cases, I am sort of shocked by the things what happened, but I think this one for me so far, the cases we've covered, has been the most shocking.
Yes, yeah. And I think it's just the age of the age, and then that disconnection from reality, I think, for me, is just baffling.
Yeah.
So in terms of further evidence, there was also CCTV footage of the pair actually on foot, just quite casually walking away from the park. Yeah. After they'd been seen by that couple walking away from the park.
Yeah. There was CCTV of Eddie getting on the bus in his blood-stained clothes. He actually got rid of Brianna's phone on the route to the bus.
Yeah.
And they just casually got on the bus and went home. But one of the pieces of evidence that we didn't talk about, which came up, is about Scarlett being able to access the dark web.
Yes.
And I've had to be very careful when I've been researching this, because I didn't want to be typing in Google, how do you access the dark web?
Yeah.
But even with our backgrounds, I didn't know how you actually got on the dark web. So I basically thought that, you get on something and it's like a VPN, you get on and then it's sort of like a Google search and you type in whatever you want to look for on there and it comes up with where you can find it. It's not like that at all. There is a lot more depth to it. And I was listening to a podcast on the trial, and they had a guy on who actually explained it, and that's his...
Yeah, he was an expert witness for the dark web.
And he said that it is called I think it was a Tor browser, and you have to actually download an app to get the Tor browser, to then get onto the dark web, to then find what you're looking for. You don't just search for it like on Google. You have to get into these chat rooms. And on the messages, she referred to finding a good red room.
And wasn't there something about onion sites as well?
Yes.
Like, that's
so when you get
element.
you get into the red room, and this colour, the red room, actually links to blood. So you know that if it's going to be a red room, there is going to be violence, murder, torture, and it's going to be quite horrific within this room. So she found her way to this red room, which is ultimately a chat room. And then you've brought all the people together that have the same interests and they know where to find things.
Okay.
And then that's where you find the onion sites.
Right.
So the onion sites, it's where it passes through a lot of different, I think it's servers.
Okay.
So that it's untraceable. So it's basically like a VPN on steroids.
Yes.
So it goes through that many places that it redirects it that you wouldn't be able to tell. And it's not just used for stuff that is very horrific like that, which I was quite shocked at.
Because the amount of, I think one thing to note, which is horrific, the amount of live streams and videos of violent and brutal attacks is phenomenal. It's horrendous.
But what is also horrendous is you can't just come across these things like how I've just explained it to you. You need to know what app to download. You need to know then how to search for things. You then need to know how to get into these red rooms.
Yeah.
You then need to know what to ask people for. You then need to know how to find the onion sites. Like all this together, how did she know how to do all this? This wasn't just she stumbled across it.
No.
It was intentional for her to go in there and do all this.
And again, I think that goes to show her as a person as well, because like we've just talked about, you know, there might be people, it's like the don't touch the red button, isn't it? There'll be kids that are interested and have heard about the dark web and want to find out more, but chances are for the majority of people, if they actually took that step and went into a red room and saw some of the content on there, they would then think, oh my God, this is horrific, this is far too much, this is not what I wanted.
Yeah.
And then never look at it again.
Yeah. A good example that the expert used is it is also used a lot, like the dark web is also accessed quite often in terms of eating disorders. So you can come across people who are like-minded on maybe Instagram from like finding posts on there about dieting, and, you know, there's all this diet culture stuff and all the, you know, like injections and whatever you can take. And then it gets more extreme. So you get linked up with these people, and the more you search for it, the algorithm will show it you more. So when you get in touch with these people, you can actually go on the dark web, and there was also rooms on there which were saying like how to starve yourself. So it's not all just about, you know, when we say the dark web, I seem to think about like torture, murder, paedophiles, things like that. But it's not all. No, there's something massive, for everything.
Yeah, and then there's a massive pretty much anything illegal, isn't it? Really.
Yeah.
It's like drugs. There's a whole side of the dark web specifically for people that are wanting to access drugs.
Yeah.
And this is the reason that we are in schools, we are talking so much about like internet safety, but also so much about trying to get kids into digital forensics.
Yeah.
Because the amount and the complex nature of that beast needs people who have that natural innate ability to be able to research and discover these things, but in a positive way to counteract
what's happening. So the police were actually saying that it is very hard for them to catch people who own these sites and who are directing people there. And the only way that they can do it is to have police officers undercover in the chat rooms and wait for someone to talk to them. And I think GCHQ have got quite a lot going on at the moment with, you know, the safety around it and trying to get people into these rooms to try and stop what's happening.
Yeah.
I'm sure they said it was GCHQ, but it's not a straightforward thing. And there's a lot of planning that has even gone into finding these live streams and these videos. And I think at one point on one of the messages, Scarlett had actually sent Eddie one of the torture videos from
and said like
from the dark web. I
found a good one.
But then he did actually say, you need to be careful with that. Like, don't get caught. Like, get out of it a bit. But it just shows their friendship, because if you came to me and said, oh, Annie, look what I found, it was something weird like that, I'd be like, Beth, you need help.
Yes.
Like, do you want me to help you? Is there something that I can do to... do you need me to ring the police or send you to someone to speak to them? Yeah. Like, I wouldn't ever
encourage it, or even just say, oh, don't, you know, just be careful with that.
Don't get
carry
caught,
on.
Beth.
But no,
it's it is very, very horrific. And she knew what she was doing in this situation. She knew.
Yeah. So we are now going to discuss the trial. So again, pieces of evidence come into that trial, but the trial was actually just 9 months after the pair were charged.
That's quite soon, because normally it's over a year, isn't it?
So again, timelines in this are really significant. So obviously the events that unfolded, that was very quick. The pair were charged just 4 days after Brianna's murder, which again, being charged with murder at that point is very quick. And then for the trial to take place just 9 months after is also significant. And the fact that actually, so the trial took place at Manchester Crown Court, but the whole trial, again, only lasted 18 days.
Yeah.
Which for such a horrific crime, generally...
It lasts a lot longer, doesn't it?
It lasts a lot longer, yeah. But I think because they had that much evidence and because it's undeniable that these two offenders were calculated...
Yeah.
It actually... And thank God, because, you know, the amount that the family... Because the family were there every single day of the trial. So the amount that they had to go through anyway was horrific. And if that would have been drawn out any longer, I can't imagine how that would have felt.
Yeah. And I watched listened to a full podcast just on the trial.
Mm-hmm.
So it was split into sections about, you know, like when they first got to trial, they called them boy X and girl Y, giving evidence.
Because again, that's because they were 15.
They were 15, so they couldn't be named at the time. But the judge, she actually lifted the restrictions and decided to name Scarlett and Eddie, because she said that when they were... I think by the time they were under 18, weren't they? And by the time it had gone to court, I think were they 16?
Yeah.
And she said it wouldn't be long before they were 18. And then when they're 18, the names get released anyway.
But that was actually, so that was after the trial. So throughout the trial, they were boy X and girl Y. But then it was actually just prior to sentencing, wasn't it?
Yes, it was.
The anonymity ban was lifted.
Yeah. And I mean, it was, there was a lot in this podcast about it being, you know, like the decision the judge made and which way it should have gone. And, you know, I think she probably made the right decision, because if she'd have held on to it when they were 18, it would have been lifted anyway. And then there would all be the media attention all over again. And just for the sake of Brianna's family, the media attention from them getting named was sort of mixed in with the sentencing.
So Esther had actually agreed with the judge's decision about the anonymity ban. God, that was a tricky sentence. Because, like we've just referenced, due to their age, it would have come out anyway. And she made the very good point of the fact that, you know, if it wasn't released then, it would have just prolonged the pain that both her family had to go through, and then actually, which we're going to come on to, the offenders' families. And she didn't want the offenders' families to have to go through that ordeal for a second time, which is incredible. But we'll come back to that. It is
absolutely incredible. When she was saying it outside court, I was like, oh God, I just couldn't even put myself in her situation.
So the testimony of the two offenders I found really interesting. One, because, again, Eddie refused to actually speak throughout the trial.
Yeah, he typed it, didn't he?
Yeah, so he typed it. Again, that was because of his selective mutism. So he didn't actually verbalise anything throughout. But, again, showing the lack of remorse and the childish behaviour, the childish nature of the pair, neither of them accepted any guilt, and both of them blamed the other one.
Yeah.
Which I just thought was disgusting.
So I think Eddie said that he went behind a tree to go and have a wee, and when he came back that Scarlett had then stabbed Brianna. But in terms of the evidence, it was actually Eddie that had the blood on his clothing, and they said that Scarlett didn't. So it was pretty much looking like it was Eddie that did the majority of the work. And then obviously Scarlett said the same. I turned around to look at something and, you know, I heard something behind me, and then it was...
Well, Scarlett had actually taken the lie one step further initially, because she'd said that it was Briana. She tried to blame Briana. She said that Briana had gone off to meet a 17-year-old that they didn't know, and that they'd left Briana with this guy that nobody knew, and so it must have been him that had actually committed the offence.
Wow.
So she went from lying about it to then, obviously, when she was caught out with the evidence, saying, oh, yeah, but it wasn't, none of it was me, it was all Eddie. Eddie said that when he turned round and saw that Scarlett had stabbed Brianna, that he panicked because he didn't know what to do, and that he then just left. But he said he ran away. And again, there's CCTV to prove categorically that is not what happened. Yeah.
And as well, they both were allowed to have fidget toys. And I think it was Scarlett that gave evidence behind a curtain so that only the jury could see her.
Yeah.
And I know that like these allowances do need to be made for children.
Yeah.
But you know, it seems crazy that one was typing out the evidence. They both sat there with fidget toys.
Yeah.
And one of them were drawing and was in another room for part of the trial. The judge said that they didn't have to come to court every single day. And I know they have to take into account that they're children, but they are also murderers.
Yeah, and I think with the amount of evidence against them for how sadistic it was, it does, thankfully, you know, the sentences were harsh. But it does kind of annoy you that there was such allowances for such a heinous crime.
The judge, though, in this case, she did actually say, look, I am making these allowances, but she said, at the forefront of my thoughts is always Brianna and her family. So I thought she did it in a quite nice way where she said, look, because the children, I've got to do this, but you are my priority.
Yes.
And I thought that was quite nice for maybe Brianna's family. So it was less than 5 hours, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So
on the 20th of December 2023, girl X and boy Y were found guilty after, like you say, 4 hours and 40 minutes it was.
Yeah, and that's pretty quick, just to put it into perspective. That is quite a quick deliberation, isn't it, for something this
100%. And again,
this serious.
You know, you've got a jury of adults who are effectively then convicting 2 children. So that's a really difficult decision to come to. They wouldn't be taking it lightly, but that goes to show how incredible the evidence and how strong the evidence was. Yeah. So that was on the 20th, and they were found guilty. Then on the 21st, the judge announced that the anonymity ban. That the anonymity ban would be lifted. Yeah. And that their names would be revealed at the sentencing hearing. Yeah. So then it was February 2nd, so there's a bit of a gap. February 2nd, which was a hearing that had impact statements from obviously Esther, Brianna's mum, but also her father and her stepfather. And again, they are completely harrowing to watch, but equally incredible at the amount of strength that they still had after that trial, to be able to stand up in front of people and talk about Brianna and talk about the whole trial. Yeah. They also heard from psychiatrists of the perpetrators, and interestingly, some of the diagnoses that the children had prior were argued by the psychiatrists in the trial. Okay. So Jenkinson was said to actually have antisocial personality disorder rather than autism. Right. Which is what, she'd been referenced to have. But then Radcliffe was said to have a mild form of autism spectrum. So again, wasn't autism, it was just a mild form of. Right. But that actually he had personality disorder. Right. So again, there was...
But then you've got the different experts with the different opinions, haven't you, there, which is conflicting each other's evidence.
Yeah. So in terms of sentencing, Scarlett Jenkinson was sentenced to life in prison. Her name was revealed, their photos were revealed, and she was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum sentence of 22 years. Yep. And then Eddie Ratcliffe was also given a life sentence, but that was a minimum of 20 years. Yeah. Which, again, is interesting because, like you say, they still don't effectively know who stabbed Brianna how many times. the thought is that he would probably have been the main perpetrator in terms of the stabbing due to the amount of blood that he had on him. But actually, we know that Scarlett was
the planner.
The one that
and
premeditated
would
the
he
attack.
have done it without her?
Yeah.
You know, we don't know, do we?
So Jenkinson will be eligible for parole by January 2044.
Wow, that seems... Saying 2044, it's so far away, but it's not really, because they're not going to be that old.
I know, that's why I wanted to mention it, because when you say like 22 years, because again, when we talk about life sentences, generally it's like max 25 years, but you don't kind of put a date on it generally, and I think that does make a difference.
Just to put this into perspective, when they get released, they will be around about my age.
Yeah, that's difficult to hear, isn't it?
It is.
Then they've got a whole life
ahead of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And yes, so then Ratcliffe will be considered, and that's an important part. They'll be considered for parole.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they'll be granted it, but that would be January 2042.
Yeah, I found it quite disturbing, though, also, that after all this, they'd said they were, they blamed each other throughout the trial. But when they interviewed Scarlett Jenkinson in prison, she actually gave a different account of it and said, yes, she did it and that she enjoyed it. And that was one of her prison interviews.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was with a psychiatrist in prison or if that was just out
just
in the open of what she talked about.
I just wanted to finish with the trial bit by, again, referencing the judge. So her surname was Yip. So Judge Yip.
Yeah.
And as you mentioned, she had Brianna at the forethought of everything that she did. And when she summed up the trial, she described the murder. And I think this is significant because she didn't put any value in the fact that they are children or they were children when they'd committed the crimes.
Yeah.
She said this murder was sadistic in nature. And she referred to Eddie Ratcliffe and said that he had a secondary motive in the attack, which was with hostility towards Brianna, specifically because of her transgender identity.
Yeah.
And we've not referenced it, and I don't really want to talk about it, but there was a specific text that he had actually sent to Scarlett which referenced why he wanted to kill Brianna.
Yes.
And I think it's disgusting, and I don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, we're not even going to give that any
mind,
any time away, sort of thing.
But I think it was really significant that the judge acknowledged that and said that I know that the reason or part of the reason that you committed that act was due to the fact that Brianna was transgender.
Yeah,
and that's disgusting.
Yeah. And there was, after Brianna's body had been found, I know some of the radio stations had actually held a minute's silence.
Yes.
And it was one with Stephanie Hurst on it.
Yeah.
And she did it on hers, and there was quite a few on the others as well. I think it was on the 17th of Feb that they did the 1 minute silence as like a tribute from like the transgender community.
Yeah. So I will now let you talk about the work.
Well, now you've been talking, my battery's gone. And I was just going to tell you all about the wonderful work of Esther.
Yeah.
But she's done such a good job in campaigning for a lot of things. But before we go on to what she's done in the campaigns, her strength throughout this has been absolutely incredible. And she actually met up with, it says it doesn't name which one, but I am almost certain that it was Scarlett's mom.
So it has, I've seen.
Oh, did you see it named? Right.
So it was actually Scarlett's mom and Scarlett's uncle that she's met up with.
Yeah.
Part of, again, to quote from Esther, part of the strength that she says she's found was in all of the vigils that were held.
Yeah.
So like Annie referenced the silencers that were held over the radio, there were actually vigils in Belfast,
all around
Leeds,
the country.
Yeah, for Brianna, and also to stop hate crimes and violence towards those in the transgender community. And she said that she found a lot of comfort in that because it's something that Brianna would have respected and had liked to have seen.
Yeah.
And that's how she found some of her strength. But even before the trial had ended, Esther was campaigning, and not even just to raise awareness of Brianna, but to actually just improve the lives of other people.
Yeah.
And so, yes, after the trial, she met with Scarlett's mother and uncle. And I think they'd met at like a coffee shop. And she said that it was her that had kind of wanted to do that.
And it was such an emotional meeting, wasn't it, in general?
Yeah.
Like, I can just imagine how that was for both sides. And one of the things that Esther says throughout this is, I lost my child, but they also lost their child in this as well. Mm-hmm. And even though their child is still here with us and still in prison, they've now got a decision to make on whether you support your child through this or what you do, because at the end of the day they're still your child. And she said she'd like to think that her as a mother would support her children in you know, whatever situation. And that must be very tough for also Scarlett's mum to see how Esther is understanding and seeing her side of it. And Esther said it brought her a lot of peace as well.
Yeah, because Esther also said that she said, at what point do we stop as a society blaming the parents?
Yeah.
You know, you do hear a lot about the offenders who did have a traumatic childhood, but as is always the case, not everyone that's had a traumatic childhood then goes on to commit crime.
Yeah.
But like she said, in this case, neither offender did have a traumatic childhood. They were your average kids.
Yeah.
And the parents have now got to deal with what their children did and the offences that their children committed.
She actually asked for people to also leave the families of the offenders alone and didn't believe that the families should be harassed. I know one of them got the windows put through and Esther was saying, this isn't fair. It's not them who committed the crimes and it's not their fault. She puts no blame at all on the families of the offenders and it is obviously absolutely horrific. And
both of the families of the offenders did actually give statements after the trial, and they said that they completely agree with the sentencing.
Yeah.
They completely agree that they should be held accountable, and they sent in their statements, because quite often they're quite brief statements from the families of the offenders.
Yeah.
But they weren't. They said, yes, it's been horrific and we've now got to deal with the reality of the situation, but we completely agree with everything.
Yeah.
Which is difficult to admit.
It is. And not only has Esther been sort of meeting up with the families of the offenders, she has done a hell of a lot of campaigning for more safety in schools as well and more safety online. And I will put the link in because there's a GoFundMe page at the moment and the target, I think, was £50,000 and they met that target. Mm-hmm. And when I checked yesterday, when I was writing all the notes down, they were up to 88,000. And that is to help put procedures and people into schools to be able to talk about these things like internet safety. And about parents as well knowing that their child has this certain app or has this certain software that can allow them to get onto the dark web, and questioning your child and saying, well, if you have got this app, why have you got it, and what would you possibly need that for? It's about communication between the parents and the children, and about knowing what your child's up to and being able to get access to their phone as well to say, like, we want to have a look at what you're doing and the majority of teenagers and children are pretty safe and they do know. Yeah. But it's about having that conversation with your children about this.
To be sure. Yeah. So Esther initially, again, while the trial was going on, was campaigning not only for greater mental health support within schools, but also for the big media platforms to take more responsibility for their actions. And actually, she's done a lot of work since. But it was actually, I could do we could both do a whole episode just on Esther.
On her, yeah.
She's so incredible. And I think what's really, for me, the most impactful is, yes, she wants to make changes, and a lot of people want to make changes, but actually what she wants to do is to choose to see the good in the world. She said she still believes in people. She wants to improve the lives of others, but actually what she's doing is choosing to see the good in people.
Yeah.
And so she said that her daughter, obviously we know that Brianna struggled with her mental health, and she said that she would spend a lot of her days helping Brianna and trying to deal with Brianna's mental health with her. She can't do that anymore. She can't help Brianna. And because of that, she wants to help improve the lives of other people. So the Peace in Mind campaign is the campaign that effectively all of this work is behind all of this work. And that was launched in September. It was September the 15th, and she launched that in 2023. So again, within the same year that her daughter had died.
Yeah. And it is actually the Mindfulness in Schools campaign for the GoFundMe page that I was just talking about that has got they've just gone over the target. So we will put the link in our description.
So they've had a lot of community support. So again, like the local football teams, local community have been kind of integral to the success of the campaign initially. But it's mindfulness in schools that they are trying to incorporate. And again, Emma Mills, who we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, she's the head teacher of Birchwood School. She actually was at the trial with Esther for every day that she could be there, and she's been integral into this campaign as well in terms of, because obviously she then knows about the curriculum and stuff like that, so she's helping from that kind of side of things.
And it's good to have someone from the teacher side, especially a head teacher, to help push this into schools, because they know the procedures better than Brianna, better than Esther, and I feel like it could really be pushed, and it is a massive help if they get this into, you know, even
part
all
of the curriculum.
Yeah.
So they're aiming for one mindfulness teacher in every school in Warrington, because that's Brianna's hometown.
Yeah.
But realistically, it should be in every school, in the UK, which is what they're aiming for. So spreading out mindfulness tools which help people build mental resilience, further empathy, and compassion for others and understanding. And
for the teachers as well to maybe train to sort of see the early signs of when someone is suffering from mental health issues, so that it can be sort of targeted and they can get the help that they need early on. So I think if the teachers could know some of the signs, that could help a lot of the children as well.
Yeah, definitely. So Emma, the head teacher, has been instrumental in the campaign as well. As of February 2024, they'd got 95,000 in excess of. Right. So you can see how it's jumped even just in that small space of time. And Esther is now working with like local MPs, bigger MPs, and social media giants to try and get them to take more accountability. Because what she actually said was that after her death, she found out that Brianna had actually been following anorexia pro pages on X, so Twitter, and that she was calling out Elon Musk and the big giants to say that this is unacceptable. But interestingly, again, powerfully, she said, and that's another reason why I will never blame the families, because they didn't know that their children were on the dark web and having these, you know, conversations.
And she didn't know that Brianna was.
She didn't know that Brianna was, you know, following sites which were detrimental to her mental health.
Yeah.
And so she said, you know, you can never blame the families.
Yeah.
But Esther was actually named by The Independent as the most influential woman of 2024.
Right.
And that was, you know, she had stiff competition. And she said she wouldn't have even thought of herself to be, you know, named amongst those women, never mind having actually, you know, received that title. But honestly, she's incredible, and I highly urge people to support the campaign, but also just watch some of the interviews with her, because she's an incredible woman, and it's testament to being an incredible woman of mother of Briana.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's the case for today. Again, if you can support the campaign Peace in Mind, then please do. And we hope that has shed some light on the case for you, and given a voice, hopefully, for Briana.
Yeah.
So
I hope we did that justice.
Yes.
And yeah, I feel the pressure's sort of been lifted a little bit now, and I just hope that you've all got a bit more of an insight and a background into that case, with it being so recent, and there's so much media stuff still out about that, isn't there? So if you want to go on, you can have a look at, you know, all the different interviews and the podcasts and, you know, documentaries that people have done on it. But yeah, I think we've done all right. Yeah, we can breathe now. Yeah. So thank you everyone for watching, and make sure you're following us on all our usual platforms, and we will see you next week.
Take care.
Bye.